If you are European living in contemporary Europe and you are somewhat interested in both history and politics, it is very hard not to feel certain cognitive dissonance stemming from the staggering difference between the perceived position and state of Europe as presented by the political elites of the continent as well as many Europeans, and the real standing of the continent in comparison to its competitors on the world stage, as well as in comparison with its position in the world affairs in the past. I repeatedly get into debates with people that genuinely seems to believe that contemporary Europe, which in this context means basically Western Europe in the broad Cold War sense of the term, are the pinnacle of human civilization that everybody is, or at least should be, looking up to and be inspired by. In these cases, I often am under the impression that I am living in some other reality than these people. Do they not see the obvious and rather rapid diminishing of importance of Europe, and especially its Carolinian core, in the world affairs? The obvious loss of competitiveness in technological innovations and the progressing economic backwardness stemming from it? The fact that the whole of Europe is, in contrast with popular rhetoric about increasing strategic autonomy of Europe you can hear from certain politicians, becoming more and more just a big geopolitical, economic and cultural extension of the United States, which are, and for a long time has been, the true core of the Western civilization and the bearer of its geopolitical and cultural influence? Do the others not feel the intruding feeling that Europe just kind of lost belief in itself, in any form of its transcendent civilizational mission, and thus Europe basically does not know why it should continue to exist, apart from some basic momentum and lack of other options? The contradictions that stem from this state of affairs, which you can observe in daily life, are plenty, and one of my favorite are many Europeans that bitterly hate and envy the Americans, which is something I will elaborate on further down the line in this video, and try to hide this bitterness behind a veil of contempt felt for Americans, usually verbally justified by the alleged American bigotry, lack of social safety nets, and malfunctionings of the American healthcare system. However justified might some of that criticism be, it is always amusing to see it coming from people that just few minutes ago finished tweeting from their iPhones about the finale of the actual season of Stranger Things or any other of many globally popular American TV shows that they watch on Netflix, while sipping Starbucks coffee, listening to the currently popular American rap music artist, and passionately adopting a number of subjects from the American political debate with zero impact on their own lives, like the debate about gun rights, police brutality and racism, abortions, or the newest topic of the cultural war that is being currently discussed on Twitter. These people are so submerged within the American socio-cultural context that I found it hilarious to simultaneously hear these people call America, and I'm quoting now, just a third world country in expensive clothes, and other similar mocking terms. Now, I just want to clarify that this video is not supposed to be either shitting on Western Europe or cheering for America. Western Europe, without a doubt, still is one of the best places on earth to live in, and it will likely stay that way for some time. But it is hard not to notice that the sources of its prosperity lie in the past, and it has lost most of its economic and cultural dynamism that could carry this prosperity forward. It lives off cultural, economic, societal and political capital accumulated in the past centuries, but it cannot continue that way forever. Europe is a continent that lives off its past while simultaneously rejects it, which is hypocritical and contradictory. There still are pockets of highly competitive, innovative and successful countries in Europe. But when you compare the European heavyweights of Germany, France, UK and Italy with the United States or East Asian economies, the pattern of falling behind becomes very clearly visible. I will thus look at the most notable examples of the decline in economy and technology, cultural influence, geopolitical and strategic position, regulatory and governing policies, and in the end, I will present my takes on what are the main reasons of this state and what trajectory might events possibly take on in the future. Economic and technological falling behind is probably the easiest of the subjects to argue about, because it is rather easily quantifiable. I will now go through several statistics that I found most illustrating in this regard. I will start with the share of the world GDP. It is relatively straightforward. The European share of GDP is falling down every couple of years. It has been the case for the past couple of decades, and it is not going to stop. The EU, in its current size, plus the UK, held on to over 35% of the world GDP in 1970. Back then, if counted together, contemporary EU states would be by far the biggest economy in the world, and it had almost 10% advantage over the United States, its only competitor in this metric. But the decline was already starting back then, and it has never stopped since. There was an uptick in the 1990s after the globalization has kicked in its full gear, and the world economy got rejuvenated by the end of the Cold War and the integration of the former foes of the West into its economic orbit. But between the years 2000 and 2010, the decline started to be more severe, and in 2017, EU, still with the UK, accounted for some 22% of the world GDP, and in 2022 it is estimated to be around 16.6%, even though this is without the UK, so the figure with the UK would be around 20%. But that is still decline of 2% in just a couple of years. And sure, the figure for the whole of Europe would be higher, since couple of relatively large economies like the Switzerland, Norway and Russia are missing. But the trend would stay unchanged. And Russia, while geographically partially European, is its own thing culturally and politically. And while it is also in inevitable decline, Russia is in different situation, and I won't really get into it in this video. Now at this point, many people would argue that the relative decline of the share of the world economy does not mean much. Europe is not in decline. Different parts of the world are just catching up. But there are several problems with this interpretation. First, the comparison with the United States shows that while the meteoric rise of Asian economies inevitably leads to developed economies' share in the world GDP decline, the decline can be more severe or less severe. While the decline of Europe clearly accelerated when the biggest ascent of China started, the United States seems to be able to hold on to its quarter of the world GDP even when other parts of the world are ascending massively. The direct comparison is also pretty straightforward. The United States overtook the position of the world's largest economy from the EU somewhere around the year 2011, and the gap has just been getting wider ever since. And at some point in the last couple of years since the COVID pandemic, even China overtook the EU in the nominal GDP metric, and the EU is thus now a third largest economy in the world. This would probably not be the case if the Brexit has not happened, but it is still significant. Every time there is a massive economic crisis, like the 2008 financial crisis or the COVID crisis, it seems that Europe gets more hurt than the US and takes longer to recover. There is a significant number of regions in Europe, especially in Southern Europe, that had not reached pre-2008 economic level to this day. Economy is one of the most important segments of competition between geopolitical players. The fact that almost every other significant player is growing faster than Europe means that the resources available to the competitors of Europe are growing in comparison to the resources available to European countries. Those resources can be aimed at boosting the military prowess and invested back into the economy and infrastructure. But the nominal GDP is not that important, one might say. When measuring living standards, it is far more relevant to look at the GDP per capita. Well, we will do just that. In 1980, the nominal GDP per capita of United States was $12,500. In Australia, it was $11,000. In New Zealand, it was $7,200. In the UK, it was $10,700. In France, it was $13,000. In Germany, it was $11,100. And in Italy it was $8,600. Estimates for 2022 shows that the nominal GDP per capita of US was $75,000. For Australia it was $66,000. For the New Zealand it was $47,000. For the UK also $47,000. In France it was $42,300. In Germany it was $48,300. And in Italy it was $33,700. So, while in 1980 the GDP per capita of the UK was circa 85.6% of the US level, 97% of the Australia level, and 148% of the New Zealand level. In 2022, the GDP per capita of the UK was circa 62% of the US level, 71% of the Australia level, and 100% of the New Zealand level. In 1980, the French GDP per capita was 104% of the US level, 118% of the Australia's level, and 180% of the New Zealand level. In 2022, French GDP per capita was circa 56% of the US level, 64% of the Australia level, and 90% of the New Zealand level. In 1980, German GDP per capita, and I assume it was just West German GDP per capita, was circa 89% of the US level, 100% of the Australia level, and 154% of the New Zealand level. In 2022, German GDP per capita was 64.4% of the US level, 73% of the Australia's level, and 102% of the New Zealand's level. And in 1980, Italy's GDP per capita was 69% of the US level, 78% of the Australia level, and 120% of the New Zealand's level. In 2022, Italy's GDP per capita was circa 45% of the US level, 51% of the Australia's level, and 71% of the New Zealand's level. So, the results of this little comparative analysis are clear. In comparison with other developed economies, the largest European economies are significantly lagging, and the gap is getting wider in time. To put it in some context, while in the 1980s, French GDP per capita was slightly higher than that of the US, the percentage difference between France and the US in 2022 is like the difference between France and Greece or Oman. And the percentage difference between the US and Italy in 2022 is like the difference between Italy and Romania or Russia. So, these differences are significant. And while no French person would likely argue that there is not a difference between the French and Greek level of development, many of them would argue that France and the US are roughly on the similar level of prosperity and development, even though there are not any measurable metrics to back that up. Now at this point, you can often hear arguments about different indexes measuring quality of life, where European countries usually fare very well. And sure, quality of life in Europe is indeed very high, but these rankings are also always quite subjective. Quality of life is not empirically measurable quantity. The criteria are chosen by someone, and I often suspect these rankings to be a little bit biased to favor certain type of countries. Let's now look at largest companies in the world by market capitalization, a metric that is especially crushing for Europe. Only 15 of the world's 100 most valuable companies were from Europe in 2022, down from 16 at the end of 2021. Before the financial crisis, at the end of 2007, 46 of the world's 100 largest companies by market capitalization were registered in Europe. 61 of the top 100 companies were from the United States, 8 from the top 10. 15 were from China. The highest ranked European company is LVMH on 14th place. LVMH is French holding and conglomerate specializing in luxury goods, headquartered in Paris. LVMH controls around 60 subsidiaries that manage 75 prestigious brands. These include Tiffany, Christian Dior, Givenchy, Louis Vuitton, Sephora or Hennessy. It is pretty telling that this is Europe's most valuable company. While the top US company is Apple, top Taiwanese company is the semiconductor giant TSMC, top Chinese company is the tech giant Tencent, and top Korean company is Samsung. Europe got LVMH. There is absolutely nothing wrong with luxury goods, but it tells you something that the top European company is not some European tech giant, but company making stuff that is based upon the fact that it is French and expensive as hell. These brands are supposed to show your status. You just won't buy your luxurious designer clothes from China, even if they would be of similar quality. But pretty much anything else you can buy from China, or America, or Korea, or Taiwan. When you look at the rankings of companies by revenues or earnings, the situation looks a little better for Europe. There are especially several European energetic giants included, like Shell, Total Energies, or Uniper. But even here, you can start to see some patterns relatively quickly. Volkswagen, founded in 1937. Total Energies, founded in 1924. Exor, founded in 1927. BP, founded in 1909. Glencore, founded in 1974. So, relatively young in comparison. Enel, founded in 1962. Novo Nordisk, founded in 1923. Nestlé, founded in 1866. I think you can understand what I'm trying to say here. Most of the captains of the European industry has been around for a really long time. And while that alone is not a problem, the absence of any younger companies among the largest European business giants is striking. Where is some European Facebook, Google, Tesla or Amazon? Nowhere to be seen. It is also very interesting that period of European falling behind started roughly at the same time when the information and communication technology boom started to gain pace, and companies such as Microsoft and Apple began popping up. The European absence in the high echelons of the tech economy is also one of the prime examples of European economic and technological loss of prominence. When it comes to modern cutting-edge consumer electronics and software, the United States and Asia are just leaps ahead of the old continent. I personally remember when the European cell phone industry, with companies like Nokia, Sony Ericsson or Alcatel, was completely steamrolled over by American and Asian smartphones. I'm sure there are some, but I probably do not know any person with European smartphone or laptop. It's all American, Chinese or Korean brands. And this technological falling behind really starts to have practical impacts on the economy. European car manufacturers had to suspend the production in their factories since they were not able to buy the semiconductor chips needed for the cars. The problem is caused by the fact that the semiconductor chips needed for cars are relatively primitive and cheap in comparison with the chips needed in smartphones or computers. The big semiconductor manufacturers like TSMC, Intel or Samsung are thus very hesitant with investing tens of billions of dollars into production plants in Europe, where basically none of the high-end stuff is manufactured. And there is a serious danger that European automotive industry, one of the crown jewels of the European and especially Central and Eastern European economy, might experience fate not that different from that of the European cell phone industry. People from within the industry pretty much all agree that while in the classic internal combustion engines, European automotive still is at the top of the world game, in the electric vehicles world, Europe is behind both America and Asia. New Chinese electric vehicle brands are entering European markets and they will soon give European manufacturers a run for their money. And if I should guess how it will play out from looking at the other fields of competition, I am not very optimistic, since both Japanese and Korean automotive industries dealt with the semiconductor crisis much better, and their sales shares in Europe are rising. Cars are also increasingly technologically sophisticated and might in the future end up becoming something like a computer on wheels. And Europe will be heavily disadvantaged at that point. Which also goes for the autonomous vehicles, since European car makers just cannot compete in the software department. European economy is lacking innovation, dynamism, is heavily overregulated, heavily dependent on subsidies, and in many segments of the economy also shielded from foreign competition by customs. I will lean more into these subjects in the second part of this series, specifically in the chapter about regulatory and governing policies. But the bottom line is that Europe is not in a very good position in today's economic climate. It is very exposed to any shocks and pressures from both the import and the export sides of the international trade web. EU's trade to GDP ratio is around 90%, which is far more than for any of the other large economic players on the planet. The figure stood on 46% for Russia, 33% for China, 25% for Japan, and 23% for the United States in the 2020. Since European demographics does not allow for economy based on domestic consumption, since Europe produces far more goods than it is able to consume, it is heavily dependent on exports for its economy to work. On the other hand, it is also heavily dependent on the imports of vast majority of commodities and natural resources needed for sustainment of industrial economy, since Europe is not that well endowed by nature in this regard and has also been depleted by centuries of industrial economy. But Europe is also increasingly dependent on the imports of tech products, like the aforementioned semiconductors, without which you cannot really make a car, washing machine, or various industrial machinery today. So, Europe has a lot to lose if the deglobalization is to take place, which looks increasingly likely to be the case. And sure, there still are successful economies with many cutting-edge companies in Europe. Various kinds of industrial machinery, pharmaceutical products, aviation industry, as well as islands of positive deviation in the newer industries, for example Spotify. But overall, the economic importance of the continent is on a steep decline, and there are no signs of this trend being reversed. One of the reasons why the market capitalization metric is so telling is because it shows what companies people have faith in going into the future. Investors clearly does not believe that European companies will help them to save and multiply the value of their money for years and decades to come. Only 4 European countries have higher GDP per capita than the United States. Luxembourg, which is basically a microstate with 500,000 citizens. Ireland, which has GDP per capita so high, mostly because American tech companies have their EU subsidiaries based there. Norway, with something like 60% of Norwegian exports being made up of hydrocarbons, and Switzerland, which is Switzerland. Many European economies are also heavily indebted. European manufacturers are paying by far the highest energy prices of all the relevant players in the world, and that is undermining the competitiveness of European industries, and they are thus relocating the production to the USA massively, since the prices of energy are several times lower there. All the described problems are likely to compound in the coming years, and Europe must tread carefully if it does not want to become a mere tourist destination for rich foreigners. In the sphere of culture, and especially popular culture, the complete and utter dominance of American culture over Europe is so omnipotent that one might sometimes even forget about it. Now, I do not know intimately inner cultural life of all or even most European countries. There of course are many significant and valuable things in many European national cultures, be it music, movies and especially literature. But one also cannot deny that American culture became to a large extent the benchmark popular culture in majority of Europe and possibly the world. From the 1960s on, the Anglophone culture started to dominate, and today in pretty much every European country you can find same-sounding rappers in the same clothes, using similar beats and trying to emulate the same African American culture, even in contexts where it does not make any real sense. It is normal that music genres are universal and they influence people across the borders, but the flow of the influence is very one-sided in this case. Only country that has been able to compete with the United States and have similar level of influence is Britain, which really stands out in the European context. It is fair to acknowledge that the level of cultural influence that country possess is greatly enhanced if this country is English-speaking. But the fact that the English has become the undisputed lingua franca of the world was just the first step leading to the future cultural domination, which is something the French are still salty about. I feel like the cultural influence has been getting even stronger since rap music started to push out rock music from the spot of the most popular and cool music genre in the world. Since while the rock musicians were mostly white teenagers and young adults from the United States and the UK, people that were not that hard to emulate and identify with from the point of view of young continental Europeans. The weird cultural dissonance I feel when I see youth from, let's say, Poland or Denmark trying to emulate the fashion, bravado, and music style of Afro-Americans is growing. That does not mean that there are not many very talented and capable rap artists in Europe. I am sure there are, especially since the youth of immigration background in Western European countries can feel connection to the themes that Afro-Americans are exploring on a more authentic level than the native population. But even the rock music's roots lie in the culture of rural black populations of the American South, which is somewhat like if lederhosen-wearing, yodeling Bavarian singers became the cornerstone of some new global cultural movement, which sounds absurd and it is hard to imagine. Native European art forms, like classical music, different variations of folk music and dances, or chanson, are not massively popular and expanding genres of the future, but relics of the past that are being nurtured by groups of enthusiasts. Sure, there are things like Rammstein, Nordic metal or Daft Punk, But those artists are already functioning in the cultural context of Anglophone popular music. There is not much popular and broadly listened to music that would really embrace and represent something inherently European, or at least I do not know about it. It is rather similar in the world of cinematography. While art movie lovers certainly have some European movies on their watching list every year, and there are very good European movies being made, they are nowhere near the reach and power of the Anglophone production. I would argue that it is getting worse with time, since in the 1950s, 1960s and 1970s you had the French New Wave, Federico Fellini or Ingmar Bergman, directors and movies that, while usually very artistic, were influential with broader audiences without being submerged in the American socio-cultural context. In the past couple of decades, when there is some European actor, director or musician that is becoming very successful and exceptional in his country, this success is then usually materialized by working in the Hollywood with the big budgets and big movie stars. The paths of glory are leading one way and nobody can deny that. When you make it big, you likely end up living in Los Angeles or New York. In the world of audiovisual entertainment, I feel like Japan has probably been more relevant than Europe in the past couple of decades, with anime being wildly successful. If it must be Europe, then London is the only option. European architectural heritage, while monumental and stunning, is also a thing of the past. I never seen any modern architecture that would not seem hideous and soulless in comparison with the cathedrals and palaces of old. The difference between them seems to me as a difference between a civilization with belief in itself and inherent beauty that it can produce, and a civilization that has lost this capability. I won't pretend that I am well informed about the state of non-fictional literature in Europe and the world to really be qualified to make this judgment. But I seriously doubt there is any new Remarque, Kafka, Shakespeare or Dostoevsky working in Europe now. I do not know what interesting to write about would they see in contemporary Europe. They would probably emigrate to America. Even the few authors I regularly hear or read about that are being praised as one of the most influential authors of today, like the French Michel Houellebecq, are mostly writing about the decline of Europe. I doubt it is much better in philosophy or sociology. Again, I won't pretend I read contemporary European philosophy, since I do value my time. But from my limited understanding of the topic, the last great wave of influential European thinkers were people around the German Frankfurt School and the French thinkers like Camus, Sartre or Foucault. Bunch of philosophers and sociologists heavily influenced by Marxism that basically sow the seeds of the cultural degeneration that we are reaping now. Just to be clear, I am not saying that Camus and Sartre were not incredible writers, they sure were. But I believe that the philosophical impacts of these movements on the soul of Europe were hugely detrimental. What is also problematic is European business culture, subject that is connected to the first chapter about economy. European business culture does not incentivize entrepreneurship financially or culturally. It is no coincidence that the paths of glory and success in business and science are mostly heading the same way as in the world of entertainment, into the West. Not only are highly skilled people much better paid in America, entrepreneurs with big dreams and big ambitions faces less regulation and red tape, less taxation, and overall more can-do culture and environment. There still is significant brain drain from Europe to America, and while the numbers are not that high, those leaving often are the most talented and ambitious people that would create valuable companies if they stayed at home. It is not a coincidence that Elon Musks of this world are going to America and not to Germany or France. If you want to change the world and make billions while doing it, you will go to Texas or California, not to Germany or Belgium. In France, the most desired work position for young people at universities are the work positions in state administration, which is very telling. European dream is not to become really rich, successful and independent, but to have a job that pays enough to pay the bills and occasional vacation is hard to be fired from and you are at home by 5 p.m. Now to be clear, this is not wrong thing to wish for and there is nothing wrong with simple life, but you also cannot reach the same results as other countries or regions that have very different and more competitive approaches. In the end of this segment, I would like to go back to the topic of Europeans hating America while simultaneously being completely submerged and I would even dare to say obsessed with American culture and politics. As I said before, it is completely legitimate to criticize a situation in a different country. But what is striking to me about this specific situation is that while the societal problems in Russia, China or India are as severe, and likely much more, than in the United States, nobody spends hours and hours debating them repeatedly all year long. I wonder, are the abortion laws in Alabama, gun restriction laws in Texas, state of police violence and racial relations in Michigan, or excesses of healthcare system in the US so relevant to the daily life of average German, Dutchman, or Spaniard to debate them ferociously? Why do you care so much? Are you really that scandalized by the state of the affairs? Or are you just trying to find new reasons to reaffirm your feeling of being better than the fat, uncultured, bigoted American? I personally believe that many Western Europeans suffer from unprocessed post-imperial hangover, and they never really come to peace with the fact that they are not the center of the world anymore. And while they would never admit it, they are still salty about it, which then manifests itself in obsessive fixation on internal problems of another country with only real influence on their lives being the voluntary implementation of the American culture norms into Europe. An example of this can be the ban on smoking, which was first ferociously rejected by Europeans before ultimately becoming the norm all over Europe. Probably the most absurd case of voluntary Americanization of a European debate were the BLM protests after the murder of George Floyd by the police. Everybody had to have an opinion, and the streets of European cities were covered by Black Lives Matter signs, and the struggle of African Americans was being compared to the situation of various ethnic minorities in Europe, even though their situation is just completely different. Because while Europeans are being salty towards Americans, they are still drawn towards the American culture, since people are drawn to the ascending and hip always and everywhere, which then just reassure the hate itself. It is a vicious cycle. Many people are often criticizing the Americanization of culture in Europe and elsewhere, but the truth is that it is not done by Americans. It is done by ourselves.